1946. Britain emerged victorious from World War II. The sun still hadn't set on the British Empire. They controlled a quarter of the world's population and a fifth of its landmass. They were still, by all appearances, a superpower. But Britain was broke, completely, utterly bankrupt, and they made a fatal decision. Instead of admitting their financial reality and pulling back, they doubled down. They tried to maintain their global empire while their economy crumbled beneath them. Within 20 years, Britain went from ruling the world to becoming Europe's economic invalid. And right now, in 2025, America is following the exact same playbook. On October 23, 2025, the US national debt crossed $38 trillion for the first time in history. That's 122% of GDP. We're now spending more on interest payments than we spend on national defense. We're bleeding $870 billion a year just to service the debt, and that number is exploding. Britain made this exact mistake. They chose empire over economic reality, and it destroyed them. In 1946, Britain faced brutal truth. 6 years of war had stripped them of virtually all foreign financial resources. The economy was in complete disarray. Industries were falling apart. Then President Truman ended Lend-Lease, cutting off the lifeline Britain depended on. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, told them the only solution was to drastically cut spending on the British Empire, which was costing £2 billion annually. But Britain didn't listen. Instead, they tried to maintain everything. The post-war military cost £200 million a year to keep 1.3 million people in uniform. They maintained operational combat fleets in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean. They funded bases across the globe. They kept 120 Royal Air Force squadrons operational, all while their economy was collapsing. This is the critical parallel. Britain refused to accept that their financial reality no longer matched their imperial ambitions. They couldn't afford to be a global military power anymore, but they pretended they could. That denial cost them everything. America is doing the exact same thing right now. The US defense budget for fiscal year 2025 is capped at $895 billion. But when you add nuclear weapons programs, veterans affairs, intelligence agencies, homeland security, and foreign military aid, total military-related spending exceeds $1.4 trillion annually. We're maintaining over 700 military bases in more than 80 countries worldwide. We're fighting multiple conflicts simultaneously, trying to contain China, manage Russia, and stabilize the Middle East. And we can't afford it. For the first time in American history, interest payments on the national debt now exceed what we spend on defense. $870 billion a year just on interest. That's more than Medicare, more than all spending on veterans, education, and transportation combined. Here's the projection. Interest costs will rise from $4 trillion over the past decade to $14 trillion over the next 10 years. $14 trillion just to service debt, not to build infrastructure, not to invest in technology, just to pay interest on money we've already borrowed. Britain faced the same spiral. Their post-war debt surged to its highest level since the Napoleonic Wars. They kept borrowing. They kept trying to maintain global power, and the cause became unsustainable. They couldn't simultaneously rebuild their domestic economy and maintain military dominance abroad. India gained independence in 1947. Palestine, Transjordan, and Egypt soon followed. By the 1950s, Britain was forced to withdraw from colonial territories. They no longer had the military or economic power to control. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the final humiliation, a failed attempt to reassert imperial power that drew condemnation from America and the British Commonwealth. Britain's economy never recovered. From 1950 to 2022, Britain went from having an economy 80% larger than Germany's to 18% smaller. They suffered decades of stagflation and currency crisis. They became the sick man of Europe. And it all started with that fatal decision in 1946, choosing empire over economic reality. America is at that exact same crossroads right now. We have a national debt of $38 trillion, growing by approximately $1 trillion every 3 months. We're running annual deficits of $1.8 to $1.9 trillion. And we're trying to maintain global military dominance that costs more than $1 trillion a year. The math doesn't work. Federal debt as a percentage of GDP is 97% and climbing. The Congressional Budget Office projects it will hit 116% by 2034 if current policies continue. For context, the only time US debt to GDP was this high was right after World War II, and we immediately started paying it down. But we're not paying it down now, we're accelerating. And interest rates are no longer near zero. For years, the US government borrowed money at historically low rates. That era is over. Every new dollar we borrow costs more to service. The debt is compounding on itself. The Peterson Foundation estimates that extending tax cuts from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act could add another $4 trillion to the national debt through 2029. Social Security and Medicare trust funds are projected to be depleted within 7 years. When that happens, benefits will have to be cut by 25% unless massive reforms are enacted. But instead of addressing these structural problems, Congress keeps kicking the can down the road. This is the British playbook. Delay painful decisions, maintain the appearance of power, hope something changes, but nothing changed for Britain. And nothing will change for America unless we make fundamentally different choices. Britain's mistake wasn't that they fought World War II or had an empire. Their mistake was refusing to adapt to their new financial reality after the war. They tried to maintain 1939 levels of global power with 1946 levels of economic capability. It was impossible, and it ruined them. America's mistake isn't that we have a military or global interests. Our mistake is refusing to acknowledge that we can no longer afford the unlimited global dominance we've maintained since 1945. The world has changed. China's economy is massive and growing. Europe is wealthy and capable. We don't need 700 overseas bases to be secure. But we're locked into Cold War era thinking that says American power requires American military presence everywhere, all the time, no matter the cost. The cost is now unsustainable. Interest payments alone consume an increasingly large share of federal revenue. As debt grows, more tax dollars go to service that debt rather than fund productive investments. This creates a vicious cycle. Less investment means slower economic growth, which means lower tax revenues, which means larger deficits, which means more debt. Britain experienced exactly this spiral from the 1940s through the 1970s. Look at what's happening right now. In January 2025, the debt ceiling was reinstated at $36 trillion. By July, Congress had to raise it by $5 trillion to $41 trillion just to avoid default. $5 trillion in 6 months. This is not the behavior of a fiscally healthy superpower. This is the behavior of a declining empire in denial about its finances. Moody's credit rating agency downgraded U.S. debt in 2025, citing concerns about the nation's growing debt burden. When rating agencies start downgrading U.S. debt, it signals that international investors are questioning America's ability to manage its finances. That raises borrowing costs even further, accelerating the debt spiral. Here's the brutal truth. America has 2 choices. We can voluntarily scale back our global military commitments, reduce defense spending to sustainable levels, and focus on rebuilding our economic strength at home. Or we can continue on the current path, pretend we can afford everything, and be forced into a chaotic, disorderly retreat when the debt crisis becomes unavoidable. Britain chose option 2. They tried to maintain empire until the last possible moment. The result was humiliation, economic stagnation, and irreversible decline. Their currency lost its global reserve status. Their industries fell behind competitors. Their living standards stagnated for decades. America still has time to choose option 1. We're not Britain in 1946, not yet. We have the world's largest economy, the most innovative technology sector, and enormous natural resources. But our window is closing. Every year we delay makes the eventual adjustment more painful. Every $1 trillion added to the debt makes future choices more constrained. China and Japan, two of the largest holders of U.S. Treasury securities, are openly discussing using their holdings as leverage in trade negotiations. Foreign confidence in U.S. fiscal management is eroding. The dollar's status as global reserve currency is being questioned for the first time in generations. America is making Britain's $1 trillion mistake. Actually, we're making the $38 trillion version. And unless we change course dramatically and soon, we'll share Britain's fate. A former superpower that chose empire over economic reality and paid the price for generations. The question isn't whether America will have to make painful choices. The question is whether we'll make them voluntarily, on our terms, or whether they'll be forced upon us by financial crisis. Britain waited too long. By the time they tried to adjust, it was too late. We're running out of time to avoid the same fate. The debt is growing, interest costs are exploding, foreign creditors are getting nervous, and we're still pretending we can afford to police the entire world indefinitely. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, America's fiscal situation is rhyming perfectly with Britain's post-war decline. Unless something changes dramatically, we know how this story ends. We've seen it before.